So hi, welcome. Thanks for coming to this talk. I'm going to talk about what it means to be a socio-technical developer. And in particular, what I want to talk about is sort of how we can build an environment, a sort of intertwined system of technical factors and social factors that is sort of like sustainable and healthy for the long run. And we'll get back to what that means and why that's sort of a worthwhile thing to be doing. But first, I have to talk a little bit about myself. My name is Einar Høst. I'm a Norwegian developer. I've been paid to do software development for 20 years now. I am currently working for the Norwegian Labor and Welfare Administration, which is sort of a large organization by Norwegian standards, at least. We are sort of the executive branch of the Norwegian welfare state, if you like. We administer roughly a third of the national budget that we spend on services such as unemployment benefits, sickness leave, childcare, and so forth, different kinds of welfare benefits. And the first thing that I want to do, sort of the first point that I wanted to make, is basically just an assertion, is that software is a social technical endeavor. And of course, when someone says something like that, there are a couple of obvious questions that spring to mind. The first one is, what does that mean? So we'll talk a little bit about that. What does it mean for a system to be social technical? And the second obvious question is, well, so what? So what are the implications of that, right? So if we sort of accept this assertion that software is social technical, what are the implications, and what are the implications for us, particularly as software developers? Okay, so what are these socio-technical systems? Well, it sort of springs out from the name, sort of obviously, that there is some sort of relationship between social things and technical things. Now, what are those things? It's very easy for us as developers, I think, when we see a word like technical, we're going to think, oh, that's the code, right? And when it's social, maybe that's the organization or something like that. But I think it's useful to think about it in sort of broader terms. So the technical part for me is more like, well, it's going to be technical artifacts, sure, but there's also sort of like knowledge structures and processes that we follow, practices, and so on and so forth. And the social, well, that's going to be sort of all the information, informal things that has to do with us being human. And that also covers like individual psychology, group psychology, and so on and so forth. Now, when I drawn this, it looks very neat and sort of organized. But an important thing about considering socio-technical systems is that these relationships between the sort of social structures and the technical structures are not necessarily so simple and linear. So you can have sort of strange effects when you try to change something up here, you can have strange effects over here, and vice versa. And that also means that if you want to sort of pursue, for instance, technical excellence, typically you have to consider, well, what are sort of the things that we need to do up here to support that. Okay. Now, one manifestation of this that some of you may have heard about is this thing called Conway's Law. Now, Conway's Law is the observation. It comes from a 1968 paper from Mel Conway that simply says that when we design systems, we tend to sort of create systems that are copies or that match the patterns of our communication structures in the organization that designs the system. Now, the famous example from the paper is that they had 8 researchers. They're going to write 2 compilers, one for ALGOL and one for COBOL. And they put 5 people to work on the COBOL compiler, 3 people on the ALGOL compiler, and the result was that you had a 5-pass COBOL compiler and a 3-pass ALGOL compiler. So basically one phase per developer. And I think Conway's Law is really just one example of sort of a broader tendency for structures to copy existing structures. So when you try to create a new structure of some kind, they tend to follow sort of be influenced or even dictated by existing structures. And then you have sort of an inverse effect as well, that since they are now sort of copies of existing structures, these new structures reinforce the existing structures. So if you now Okay, you created something that would influence that from something you had before, and you want to change this now. Well, it's going to be prohibited by this new structure you have. When I talk about structures and forces like this, I basically mean anything that influences our work. And some of those are going to be structures that we build ourselves, like our technical artifacts, or they could be the organizations that we form. But there are also sort of like other structures that greatly influence and impact how we work. Important one at NAV where I work is Norwegian law, and also the structures of how we're financed. That has sort of profound impacts on how we shape our work. Okay, so this was sort of like a very broad picture of socio-technical systems. Let's try to sort of make it a little bit more concrete, a little more down to earth perhaps, and see what happens at sort of at the ground level as a developer. So an example, say you're starting a new job as a software developer, maybe you're sort of a consultant, you're being hired to do some work in some organization. So this is you now, this is supposed to be a blue dot, all these others are gray dots. And, well, the gray dots are the people you're going to work with. And you don't know much about them, that's why I draw them as gray. But this is now you, and you come there and probably have some ambitions and hopes for how this is going to work out. And maybe the person who hired you also has some hopes connected to that. Well, how is this going to play out? And of course, the simple answer is it depends. There are a million unknowns in this picture. First of all, who are you, right? So obviously, you're an excellent developer, probably one of the best in the Northern Hemisphere, but that doesn't really tell us much, right? Everyone is the best. So we need to know more, so you're one of the unknowns here. And of course, there are many other unknowns, such as they. Who are they now? What do they want? So, and it depends on the sort of shared context that you're all in. And that context is going to be multifaceted, have some systemic nature. It's going to be largely invisible, which is a problem, and it's going to be sort of all mixed up. But let's ask some more questions. Why are you there in the first place? So what's your role going to be? Are you there to sort of, are you fresh out of university or whatever, and you're going to be a junior developer? Or are you one of these senior developers who've seen everything before? I'm going to do it one more time, I guess. You're going to be a tech lead or an architect or something else. There are lots of different roles that you could have. It could be a product leader or a user experience expert or a tester or anyone sort of contributing to software development in some sense. And another interesting question, well, what's expected from you, right? And that's going to sort of be related to your role, but that's not the whole story, I think. Or maybe you're there to be sort of the 10x developer, right? The one that you've been waiting for, because obviously you don't have, the problem was always that they didn't have good enough developers, but finally you arrived, and then that backlog is going to be burned up. So you might be there to be sort of the fastest Jira ticket processing machine in the north. Or you could have sort of like a sort of more fluffy ambition. Maybe you're there to help the team move towards some sort of better architecture. Maybe you're there to coach a team of developers in some practices that they want to adopt. So it could be ensemble programming or something like that. Or even more fluffy, maybe you're there to help build a better team culture. It's an ambitious goal. So what are your goals? Now, if you're a consultant, the right answer to that question is, well, I'm there to provide value for the customer. And that might be true. Another one is you're probably there to provide income for your employer. We don't talk about that much, but it's sort of implied, right? You might be there to earn a decent paycheck for yourself. That's also sort of a fair and honest part of the deal. You could, of course, also be there to create an awesome product, that you believe in the product and you think it's very cool to be working on. Or it could be that they're using some sort of cool technology that you want to have on your resume, so it's part of building your career, or even to create a name for yourself. Perhaps you have the opportunity to work with some people that you admire and respect, and so it's an interesting opportunity for growth, and maybe just to have fun. And all of these are sort of valid reasons, but probably not just one of them, right? It's going to be some mixture. Another thing that's going to play into this is sort of your time frame. Now this is where it's a little bit different if you're a consultant and or a full-time employee, or an in-house developer, as we call it. So as a consultant, sort of fundamentally, your time frame is going to be limited, right? So you might have like a 6-month contract, a 1-year contract. And it might very well be that you're going to have that contract renewed, but it's still going to sort of affect a little bit how you think of your role, and also how other people think about your role. Or it could be more a long-range thing. Now, when I used to be a consultant many years ago. When I sort of quit my career as a consultant, it was to be able to work more long-range, right? To work on the culture at the place where I worked for a longer period of time. But regardless of that, I'm going to make an assumption for this talk, is that whether or not you're a consultant, whether or not you're there for short-term or long-term, you want some sort of impact, right? You care about your work, you sort of want to improve how the work is done at the place you're at. Now, to make it even a bit even more concrete and to reduce some of the variables, I'm going to talk about myself. So I'm fairly concrete. So this is me. I'm exactly this and nothing more, I guess. So I'm now the blue dot, and this is me starting my new job. So I bring with me now 20 years of experience of software development, and I want to have some sort of impact, right? I want to use whatever knowledge and experience I have to do better work. And of course, I come with a bag of opinions, right? I'm going to mention some of those. One thing is that I believe in domain-driven design. So I think properly modeling the problem that you're trying to address is important to sort of combat the problem of accumulating complexity in software, right? And of course, some of you and some of the people at the place where I start working might not agree with me, and that's perfectly fine. That's perfectly normal. So, and we're going to sort of have to work with that. I am skeptical of what I like to call process theater. For instance, a lot of so-called agile processes are mostly cargo culting, right? So they do these processes, they follow the practices, and then hopefully that automatically turns the whole organization into something that's agile. The problem is not that I'm sort of against agile as such. The problem is pretending that you're agile while you're really not. That's a problem. I believe there is a deep need for leadership and strategy, and I think, unfortunately, that we often have a lot of initiative. We want to do good things, we have good intentions, but we lack direction of. At the same time, I'm very skeptical at sort of top-down leadership with little, in terms of feedback mechanisms. In fact, I'd like to recommend this book by James Scott. It's called Seeing Like a State, which is all about, well, it's not about software development, but it is, I think, I'm going to argue, about socio-technical systems. Right? And it talks everything about what can go wrong if you sort of want to implement some grand scheme for your system and don't take feedback from the actual sort of, don't take local concerns into account and listen to the actual feedback and the learning that comes from that. I believe in incremental improvements. I'm skeptical of grand rewrites. I believe in what we call empowered autonomous teams. But again, not in this process theater kind of sense. Like just labeling a team empowered and autonomous, it's not going to help much, right? I'm very skeptical of what you can call individual programmer heroics, which is maybe that 10x dev. If you have to rely on these kinds of heroes, chances are you have some systemic problems in the organization, and that's what you should be working at. But again, all these are just examples. I'm not that interesting. I'm just an example, right? So I have my opinions. Other people are going to have their opinions. And the real message here is that I'm human. I'm complex. I bring with me some knowledge and some experience, which is obviously shaped by whatever I've done in the past. I have my strengths and weaknesses. I bring with me my hopes and fears. I am sort of in various contexts confident and insecure. And of course, I have my pet peeves. There are things that I'm going to rant about to people who are nearby until they manage to escape. I have some sort of limited rationality. I am largely driven by emotions, even though I sometimes like to pretend otherwise. I have my cognitive biases, and I have blind spots. And blind spots are kind of important. There are things that are sort of in the environment that I'm not going to notice because it doesn't affect me directly. Right? And I try to be aware of that, but it's at the same time, you are actually blind. Right? So that's sometimes a problem, that you can't really see the full story of the environment that you're in. And lastly, what I want to mention is that I am made up of narratives. And what I mean by that is that I have this sort of massive web of stories about myself that explain who I am, what's important in life, how the world works, and so on and so forth. And these stories sort of make up my self-image and my identity. And an important thing is that it's an image of myself, right? It's not necessarily myself as such, but it's how I view myself. And everything is always more complicated. What I really think I have is a bunch of self-images, and I try to pretend that it forms sort of one unified thing that's me. But that's, I think, largely a fiction. There's another interesting book. There's this horrible picture, unfortunately. It is the only one I found online. It's a book called The Self We Live By, which it talks about our notion of self and how that's evolved over time. I recommend reading that. But okay, so what are these narratives? Sort of fundamental narratives about myself, things that I believe in. Like most people, I guess, I fundamentally believe that I'm a good person, right? And that's important to me, to be a good person. If I were to be pressed on it, I could probably come up with some stories or some examples, concrete stories from my life that prove or provide evidence that I'm a reasonably good person. To make that story believable, both to myself and to others. I picture myself as a pretty good developer. Every developer does, I guess. But it's important to me also, right? I think I do my best. I do think I deserve my paycheck. I'm not saying that developers aren't overpaid in comparison with some other people in the society. It might be that things should be calibrated better, but I guess I deserve my paycheck sort of as much as the next developer, right? Now, what happens if these stories that I tell about myself are threatened in some way, that something happens that bring these narratives into doubt? Well, what's going to happen is I'm going to experience what's known as cognitive dissonance, because what's going on is inside my head now I have two stories about myself. And that can be very unpleasant. Right? You have one thing that says, well, I'm a good person, and then you have this other story that says something else. So when that happens, I need some way to resolve that dissonance. And it is important that I resolve it in such a way that I get to keep my original positive image of myself. And in fact, if I'm unable to keep that story, I'm going to experience what's known as an existential crisis, and that's no good. So for that reason, I have these self-defense mechanisms in place. And they're not necessarily very conscious, but if you try and if you start noticing, you can sort of feel them when they kick in, right? Now, say someone says something that comes into conflict with my idea that I'm a good software developer. What's going to happen? Well, very rapidly, two things are going to happen. One thing is that, well, whoever made that accusation, I'm going to like them a whole lot less. And then I'm going to start arguing, either out loud or just inside my head, on how they're really wrong, and they're the one that's the bad developer, right? But of course, this isn't just me. I'm using myself as an example here because it's much easier for me, and it's also as a clever trick to avoid triggering your self-defense mechanisms. Right? Much easier for me to say this is about me than it is about you, but then I can generalize, right? This is my clever trap. And I think, this is sort of one of my pet peeves, I guess. I think our self-defense mechanisms, some of them at least, are very easily triggered, and in particular those that has to do being a good software developer. Sometimes just the fact that someone used a different technology from you to solve a different problem can feel like an implicit accusation, right? So maybe I'm running my services on Kubernetes, maybe you have some serverless functions, maybe I have a GraphQL API, maybe you have a REST API, maybe I'm using Java, maybe you're using .NET. That's the problem. Who made the right choice, right? It would be nice if we could sort of move past that, but I think this is quite real. But that was a pet peeve. So if we return to this picture, of course the problem is I'm not the only sort of unique person here, right? Everyone is like this, and we have sort of all these different people, everyone's a different kind of dot, and when different things happen, we're going to sort of react differently to that. But with these sort of shared patterns that we all have our self-defense mechanisms, we all have our biases, and so on and so forth. But it gets worse. So what happens if we add groups of we on top of this? These are now sort of like, say these are team boundaries. But it's always even more complex. Say these could be 3 of the 4 people who wrote the original legacy system that we're in the process of replacing. The 4th guy left for whatever reason. These 2 work out together once a week. So they have this back channel of communication and trust, and they're going to sort of complain to each other about whatever is wrong in each of their teams. This is a friend of mine who recommended that I applied for this job in the first place, and so on and so forth. So we have all these groups, the different we's on top of all the different me's. That means we have group identity as well as the individual identity, and we have mechanisms with group psychology in addition to individual psychology. And I like to say sometimes that me is just the smallest we, right? It's a me of 1. That means that we have all the same tendency that I talked about, these cognitive biases, self-defense mechanisms, operating at these different group levels as well. Makes for a pretty sort of complicated picture. Now, in this messy environment, how we're going to work well together towards this goal of sustainable socio-technical systems? I think, well, first, we're going to have to talk about the reluctance to talk. And I'm talking about the typical software developer's typical reluctance to talk. Now this is a graphical illustration. You can tell that I've been a back-end developer for 20 years, so I need to keep it very simple. This is me sitting at my desk, in case it wasn't obvious. I'm the blue dot, this is my desk. And I have a Jira ticket now. Let's say there's a problem with this Jira ticket. There's some sort of ambiguity. It could mean different things, right? Something unclear. What am I supposed to do? Maybe there are several possible solutions with some different qualities to it. And when that happens, I'm going to be subject to the strongest force that a developer knows, which is the desk force. This is a force designed to keep me sitting at my desk. I'm sort of half joking, but I really shouldn't be, because I think it's very real, right? Leaving the desk means that you're entering sort of the land of unknown trust, right? Maybe I need to go and talk to someone. Who is that someone, right? Maybe I know exactly who I should be talking to. Maybe I know who I should be talking to get a referral to the person that I should really be talking to, and how much do I trust that person? How comfortable am I talking to that person and expressing my doubt about something? And of course, the chance is that you'll encounter another human being, which means that they might also be reluctant to talk. And it's even worse than that. If you decide to start a conversation, that means that you're going to have to articulate your problem. This sort of gut feeling that something is ambiguous is no longer sufficient. You're going to have to put it into words. And you're going to have to put it into words in such a way that they will be able to understand what you meant. And of course, if you're able to do that and the answer is something that you didn't like, that's a problem too. And you might have to enter these sort of discussions and negotiations, because after all, there is some sort of ambiguity that you need to resolve, so some sort of resolution must be made. And of course, there's also a possibility of conflict, and you could, without knowing it, sort of march straight into sort of a minefield of organizational politics in the worst case, because we have to ask ourselves again, why is there an ambiguity? Why isn't this task clear? And it could be very simple, and this is probably the most usual case. Maybe they're just bad at expressing themselves, or they left out some important sort of context because they thought it was implicit and it wasn't. This happens all the time. But it could also be that there's a deeper problem. There might be some sort of indecision and conflict hidden there. Maybe you have different stakeholders who have different opinions about what this task should be. That's very easy to hide in natural language. So you sort of gloss it over, and then when it gets time to implement it, that's when you sort of discover that this doesn't really add up. Of course, the important question then is, do I want to trigger that? I was sitting peacefully at my desk, right? What happens then? Well, it's the self-defense mechanisms, isn't it? Right? All kinds of rationalizations why I don't actually need to talk to anyone. They're probably busy, right? Can't possibly bother them with this little thing. They'll just laugh at me. Think I'm stupid for not understanding this perfectly clear task. And besides, no one else seems to be asking these questions. They're all sitting at their desks, hacking along, closing Jira tickets. And so, my brilliant mind comes up with the idea that I can sort of resolve this ambiguity by making some sort of assumption. And I call it an assumption because that sounds like something that's reasonable to do. Right? It sounds much better than guessing. Definitely better than sort of just making stuff up. If I'm very sort of virtuous and try to do the right thing, or try to convince myself that I'm doing the right thing, I might run it by some sort of proxy person. Maybe I grab a coworker, right? Someone I have a high level of trust with, and over lunch I'm going to say, oh, well, I had this ambiguous task, and I made this assumption, is this reasonable? And they're going to say yes, because they have no skin in the game, and they want to support you. But it makes you feel better, right? So now everything is fine again. The problem with assumptions is that they're sort of bets against the future, right? And if you're wrong, it's going to go back and haunt you, right? If there is really a sort of hidden, unresolved conflict in your organization that's causing this ambiguity, well, it's definitely not going away by you making some sort of arbitrary choice. So there's a chance that you will have put one of these into your socio-technical system now. Of course, the good news is, I don't know how long the average developer is on the average project or product, maybe a couple of years, 3 years. The chances are that you'll have moved on when this thing goes off. That's the good news for you, and that's the bad news from the perspective of building sustainable socio-technical systems. So it would be nice if we could talk instead. Now, how do we talk? That can be difficult too. In particular, I think of all those self-defense mechanisms that I mentioned before, rhetoric is probably number one, right? So say now we have a technical discussion of some kind, and you want it done in a particular way, so you tell me do X, right? but I don't want to do X for whatever reason, right? And so I say YAGNI, and that's a acronym for you ain't gonna need it, and it's a sort of, it became popular sort of it came out around the same time as the Agile movement took off, I think, some 20 years ago. And it's been with us ever since. And it started out, it's a sort of deeply ingrained heuristic for software developers. And I think it started off as a reminder that we should keep things simple, but then it sort of evolved into something else. It's more like an incantation these days. It's something that you can hold up in front of you, and sort of the message to the other person that you're talking to that they're supposed to go away and stop discussing. So I say YAGNI, and I hope that's the end of it. But fortunately, you have some experience with this rhetoric game as well, so you're going to say, but this is best practice. Right? I dealt you a little punch, and then you decide to punch back, but I still don't want to do this, so I'm going to say, well, but it's gold plating to do it. It's over-engineering. And you can retort, well, double down and say, what is the pattern? But by that time, I'm starting to get desperate, so I'm going to say, but there's this uncle over there that says that I should be doing this. And hopefully you're going to say, well, my aunt says, well. Of course, we could go on like this for quite a while, but it's not very fruitful, right? Whatever it is, there is some, it looks like ping pong, but whatever it is not very effective communication. In fact, I guess if we're talking about patterns, this is a communication anti-pattern. So we're sort of throwing these rhetoric devices and sound bites at each other in hope for the other person to sort of give up. I think we need to do much better, because communication really is the key to better software development, and this is terrible communication. I think when we're talking about talking, it's important to realize that you can't really win by fighting people's narratives, these narratives that we have about ourselves. So I think a question worth asking then is, if I don't want to do X, why is that the case? And that's a question that I should be asking myself, and the other guy should be asking themselves as well. Well, it could be many possible reasons. One is, well, I could be thinking that X in general is a very bad idea, we should never do X. Or it could be that I think, well, in some context, in the right context, X might be a good choice, but not in this one. But then it gets more interesting. Maybe I would like to do X, but I don't really know how. Right? Maybe I don't feel confident that I could do this X thing on my own. Maybe I don't fully understand what X means. Maybe I've been to a conference when they talked about X, all the virtues of X, but I didn't really quite get it. If that's the case, why don't I say so? Why do I resort to these sort of rhetorical devices and sound bites instead? I think the fundamental problem is trust, right? If I don't trust you, I might not sort of dare to be completely honest about what's the real reason for me not wanting to do X. So the mutual trust between us is going to be determining what we're comfortable and not comfortable sharing. So how do we build trust then? Because trust does need to be built. It doesn't come automatically. And I think we need to start with a little bit of curiosity. We need to be curious about other people and why they hold the opinions that they do. We need some empathy, the ability to sort of see, take in someone else's perspective, see things from their side, and to show a little bit of humility. And these things are important because they allow us to listen. Right? An important thing when we're sort of entering this attempt at a better communication is that we need to start with ourselves, because and we need to be able to sort of be prepared to actually change your own mind, because it's a problem if the reason that you're doing all this humility and empathy thing is sort of just as a trick while waiting to convince the other person, because then that's sort of not a very genuine starting ground for a conversation, right? And I think it's very important to show that you can and actually do change your mind in practice, not as sort of a theoretical claim that you go, oh, I change my mind all the time and never do it. People are going to look through that. Now, there are some practical techniques that we can use, and it has to do with how we work. And which of these are available to you are also going to be dependent on the environment that you're in. Again, if you're a sort of consultant at a short contract in sort of an old-fashioned rigid organization, probably some of these are going to be off limits, but there's nothing wrong in asking, I guess. One approach is coaching, and I say that not in the sort of like disinterested sort of professional coach. I'm not just going to ask some questions and I'm not going to sort of provide any opinions. I mean something more like working with people, working together, right? And again, it's important to notice that you can't really make people change their mind. What you can do is help people reach a point where they're able to change their own minds, right? If you try to force people to change their mind, they're just going to resent you for it, right? Now again, if you try to force me to do this X thing that I was protesting against, well, first of all, I'm going to think you're arrogant and stupid. I'm going to do X very poorly. X is going to fail. That's going to make me feel like I was wrong and I was right and you were wrong. And the trust between us will have eroded, right? So we're at the worst place than where we started off. I think, again, if you want people to do X, help others be successful, right? So show people how to be successful with this X thing that you believe in. And the best way to do that is to help working with them on their problems using the approach that you advocate. It might be that they learn something, maybe you learn something, and hopefully you'll build some trust. Sort of a generalization of this is working in these ensembles or mobs, right? And for me, this is sort of a continuous, multi-directional coaching thing that we're constantly showing each other, not only how to do X, but also Y and Z and everything else. There's actually works for knowledge transfer, or knowledge exchange, I guess. Also good because they're a counterforce to this desk force, right? It's much harder to fool an ensemble than it is to fool yourself. Yeah, so if the mob or the ensemble now discovers there's some ambiguity in the JIRA ticket, they're going to be much more virtuous with respect to what you should do. So they're actually going to go talk to someone. I think at least it's a greater chance that they'll go talk to someone. And I think also ensembles are much better at figuring out who they should talk to because they have a broader network of people that they know. And they have also different levels of trust established with these people. So you can sort of get the net effect of all the sort of different trust relationships that you have. And ensembles also overcome some of this sort of social awkwardness because you come as a group and not as an individual, and that gives you some sort of credibility, right? Well, if there's 4 people coming to talk about to me to talk about this, it must be an important thing, right? And also, I think this is important. Ensembles are already a conversation. That's how ensembles work. There's a sort of an ongoing conversation, and when basically what they're doing is just inviting one more person in to be part of that conversation, right? Now, finally, I want to talk a little bit about autonomy because we talk about autonomy all the time. But what is it really? Right? It does sound nice, right? It has these positive connotations. We want autonomy, but what is it? What does it mean when we say that we want increased autonomy? Is it freedom? And if it is it freedom to do something? Or is it freedom from something? Now in Norwegian, there's a phrase that goes frihet under ansvar. That means something like freedom with the applied assumption or understanding that you will use this freedom in a responsible manner. Very succinct. And it has to do with some sort of accountability. And that doesn't mean that you're going to be a scapegoat if something goes wrong, but it means that you're willing to own your own choices. For me, it has a little bit like just being adults, right? Because I think children and adults have different kinds of autonomy, right? A child has autonomy. If you put it in a kindergarten, they're going to run around and splash all the puddles of water and everything. So they have some freedom, but within those bounds, right? whereas adults have a different kind of freedom. They can do more things, but at the same time, they have this implied understanding that when they exercise that freedom, it might have consequences. I think it would be nice if we were better at sort of not just accepting, but actively claiming responsibility for outcomes as a team. I think the autonomy that we can achieve, if you want autonomy, we're going to have to recognize that it's going to be a function of the responsibility that we're willing to take. Because it's an important thing to consider, well, what do we want with this autonomy? And if you want it to be about something significant, something that's important to the organization or the business, then we're going to have to claim some responsibility, right? If we don't, then it's sort of fairly obvious that someone else is going to have want to have a word about what you should do and what you shouldn't. I think we should broaden our engagement and sort of try to address this problem that we're still largely operating, well, sort of developer teams, even sort of self-proclaimed cross-functional, empowered, autonomous teams, all the sort of good labels that we put on the teams these days, still often operate at a different plane of existence from the rest of the business. And in particular, what distinguishes those sort of planes of existence is that developers still focus on the delivery part, and not so much on things that have to do with the allocation of money, for instance, or strategy, what should we do next? I think a question that I would like to ask is, well, can developers be trusted with money? When I say that, it's not like, okay, can we give them money to determine, well, how many pizzas we're going to buy, or what kind of keyboard you're going to have, or something like that. I'm talking about, could a team have its own budget for everything, right? For the resources that are going to work on that team, for instance. And the converse is that, well, are developers interested in having that conversation? Would they accept the responsibility and accountability that comes from maintaining their own budget? I think we should, if we want real autonomy, we should engage with sort of broader part of the socio-technical context. Otherwise, what we're going to be left with is an autonomy that's fairly skin-deep and insignificant for the rest of the business. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. First, the first point that I wanted to make is that software is a socio-technical endeavor. We are all human, for good and bad, and we tend to protect our self-images fiercely. We need to get good at establishing trust to enable effective communication and collaboration. I think everyone can lead and have impact in these socio-technical systems. And if we do that, we might be able to attain this goal of sustainable socio-technical systems that are both pleasant to be part of as developers, pleasant to work in, healthy to work in, and capable of delivering good technical systems, and not just like for the next year, but for the long run. Okay, thanks.